Sad pictures from Cairo as Friday prayers are winding down, and what was expected to be a massive protest there may not happen. The Muslim Brotherhood telling people now to stay away from Tahrir Square this morning and asking for a peaceful march in other parts of the city instead.
And new developments in Libya. The airport in the city of Benghazi, where 4 Americans were killed this week, is now shut down for security reasons. That is 4 people are now in custody in connection with those killings. Welcome back to Early Start. I'm Christine Romans for you this Friday morning.
And I'm Brianna Keeler. 29 minutes past the hour. New this morning, the massive protests expected in Egypt as Friday prayers come to an end, so far not materializing. The Muslim Brotherhood urging people not to gather in Tahrir Square and instead urging peaceful marches in other parts of the city. Now, that wasn't the case there last night as fighting, fires, and violence erupted throughout the city. Meantime, protests spreading to 11 countries, from as far west as Morocco to as far east as India. The worst of it in Yemen, where at least 5 Yemenis were killed after protesters stormed the American embassy in Sana'a. Protesters destroying cars and property as the Yemeni military brought out water cannons to control the crowd. And in Libya, news overnight that 4 people arrested in connection to the killing of Ambassador Christopher Stevens and 3 other Americans. We now know the identities of the other 2 American victims killed in the attack, Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods, both former Navy SEALs who were acting as security.
Meantime, this morning, more U.S. firepower has arrived, the president vowing all necessary steps to protect U.S. citizens around the world. And new information on the mysterious filmmaker who duped his cast and lit the match. We're covering this important story only the way CNN can. We're live in Libya, Egypt, and Washington, D.C. First to Cairo, where violent protests raged through the night. Riot police carrying shields and batons rushing several hundred protesters. Calls this morning by Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood for peaceful marches. Also calls for protests in Iran and the Gaza Strip. And large protests expected in Baghdad and Iraq's second largest city, Basra, as well as Amman, Jordan. Ian Lee has been following the developments in Cairo. And Ian, what's the scene like right now? I know they were constructing a perimeter wall. Are police pulling back from that at this point?
Well, that's exactly right. The police have pulled behind that wall. And Christine, I remember we were just talking a little while ago about how there was a lull. Well, that lull is over. Police and protesters are battling it again. But the police have moved behind that wall. That wall is a concrete wall that's roughly 10, 15 feet high. They're using tear gas behind that wall to disperse the crowd. And this wall is about 30 yards from the embassy. So it's really the last stand for the police before protesters will be at the wall of the embassy. So things have once again picked up. Tahrir Square is relatively small compared to Egypt standards. A few hundred in the square who are peacefully protesting. The violence right now is around the embassy.
Overnight, we know Egypt state-run news reporting some 37 people arrested in connection with the embassy attacks. What are the details of those arrests?
Well, out of those 37, 30 are charged with thuggery, assaulting police officers, and destroying public property. It's just the Egyptian government's way of telling people that they are holding people accountable for the breach that happened Tuesday night when we saw protesters scale the U.S. Embassy wall and tear down the American flag.
All right, Ian Lee in Cairo. Thank you, Ian.
The anti-American rage seemingly spreading like a wildfire. In Iran, hundreds of protesters gathered outside the Swiss embassy in Tehran, shouting "Death to the United States." The Swiss embassy handles U.S. interests in Iran and is being heavily guarded by police. Demonstrators are calling for all U.S. embassies in Muslim countries to be suspended. And in Iraq, hundreds taking to the streets of Baghdad, burning American flags and denouncing the U.S. as the enemy of the people. Iraq's prime minister denouncing the U.S. film that's sparking all the outrage, calling on, quote, all divine religions to go after the, quote, racists and stop them from spreading their dangerous thoughts.
Let's bring in now Peter Brooks. He's a former member of the Assistant Secretary of Defense and currently a senior fellow with the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank. Nice to see you again this morning. As we're following all this, what should be the American response at this point?
Well, I think the American response has been appropriate so far. Obviously, we have to secure our embassies, make sure that they are not breached. We have to call upon the governments that are responsible, Christine, for security outside of the embassies. I mean, this is something that is part of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. They need to make sure that outside of the embassy that it's secure and American personnel and diplomatic missions. We also have to call on these governments to, tamp down the violence. To call on people to restrain from violence. And we also, I think, have to, especially in the case of Libya, think about, getting the perpetrators of these terrible acts that took place at the Benghazi consulate. Now, obviously, we got to figure out who did this. That's the important thing. You got to be able to figure out who did it. It seems to me that the people who were probably arrested in Libya were probably folks they had able to have pictures of and were involved in some of the violence there. Whether they're involved in the horrible violence that led to the death of 4 Americans is unclear at this point, or whether they're part of a radical or a terrorist group is unclear. But I think, we have to, start making declaratory statements and then take actions when we know where we should be, which direction we should be going.
I mean, you wrote an op-ed that was such an interesting point about this warning in Cairo and Tripoli. I want to read it. To Cairo and Tripoli, both in the formative stages of forming permanent governments, the warning is twofold. Don't get too close to Washington, and don't think of veering too far from the Islamist hard line. What we saw in Benghazi and what we saw in Cairo, one was a mob, one was a very well-armed attack on a U.S. mission. But politically, you say that there's a real clear choice happening here.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, especially if you look at Egypt, a very, very important country in the Arab world, a very, very important country to the United States. I mean, this is you have a government in there whose leader is an acolyte of the Muslim Brotherhood, but there are much more hardline groups in that country, political parties. And I think some of these protests are telling these leaders, don't get too close to the United States. Remember, Egypt was close to the United States. It's not so close anymore. You heard what the president said the other day. And you better pay attention to what we want you to do in terms of politics, in terms of social policies. And I think the same thing, you're right, it's probably more Egypt in that case, but I think the same thing we're seeing around the Muslim world, and I think these are warnings to these new governments that they better pay attention to the hardline parties in their countries.
I want to play quickly what President Morsi said about the attacks, and I want you on the other end of it. Tell me, was that enough? Is he moving in the right direction? Listen.
We assured President Obama that we will be keen and we will not permit any such event, any such occurrence in our country against the embassies present in our territories.
Is it enough?
Well, it's 4 days late, isn't it? I mean, that's the first thing that comes to mind. We're in the 4th day of this crisis. A lot could have happened in the previous 3 days in Egypt. We could have ended up in a situation like we had in Benghazi. So, yeah, it's about time he came around on this, and he probably is very concerned about what he's hearing out of the United States, out of Congress in particular, about the relationship between U.S. and Egypt. So I think he should have come out much earlier, Christine, with saying that. And whether it's going to be enough, we'll have to see. And we're going to have to see whether his security forces are able to provide for security for the U.S. Embassy. As your correspondent just noted, things are starting to get hot there again.
All right, Peter Brooks, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it's not looking good in some must-win states for Mitt Romney's chance of winning the White House. We have new polls from key battleground states, and we'll talk about what they mean coming up.